Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to be here with you one more time this week. We talk about heaven on earth, and we talk about a world free from disease, poverty, and conflict. And we say we can live in this heaven while on earth right now. But what precisely does that mean? How do we live in such a world? I think that with all things that go on in the world, in our daily lives, in our family, within ourselves as well, it can be very difficult for us to perceive or understand the true meaning of that. And today we're going to be looking into that very topic. What did Meishu-sama mean by this? We'll be doing this studying Kyoshu-sama and Masaaki-sama, Receiving the Will of Meishu-sama, number 24. I really look forward to reading with you, so stay tuned as we begin right after this. As we begin this week's study, let us, in the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu-sama, one with Jesus Christ, recognize that it is only by God's grace, by Kyoshu-sama's permission, that we are able to hold such studies. Let's also recognize that everything we are feeling in our daily lives, all our thoughts, all our feelings, are the reflections, the thoughts and feelings, the sum total of our ancestors that are alive, breathing within each one of us. And let us, together with them, return to God as ones who have been forgiven and saved, and share God's blessing, God's salvation, God's forgiveness, and God's salvation with each one of them from heaven in the name of Messiah, during the study and in our daily lives. So with that thought in mind, let us begin this week's study, Kyoshu-sama and Masaaki-sama, Receiving the Will of Meishu-sama, number 24, Living in Heaven while living on earth. In heaven, there is no disease. Church Canon. With great fear of God, we acknowledge that the Lord God is our true Father, the one and only God. We revere Meishu-sama as the model for all humanity and as our own example to follow. Meishu-sama, who was born anew as the true child of God, the Messiah, by receiving the divine will that God accomplished in heaven. We believe that Jesus Christ, who 2,000 years ago embodied the name of Messiah, the name most holy and high, is serving the Lord God in unity with Meishu-sama. We regard the sacred word of Kyoshu-sama, who reveals to us the will of Meishu-sama in this material world, as the sole, absolute, and irreplaceable foundation in advancing our mission here on earth. Words of prayer. God, I acknowledge that you are alive. Within me, you are alive. I thank you for nurturing me to be newly born as your child. May this blessing be shared with all. In the name of Messiah, which is one with Meishu-sama, I surrender myself to you. Please use me as you wish. Thank you very much. This week, I chose the following post on Instagram for us to reflect on. This comes from Kyoshu-sama's sacred word at the Grand Ancestor Service in 2014. And he says, "It was Meishu-sama who achieved being born anew as a child of God and became a complete human being in the eyes of God." Kyoshu-sama. It was Meishu-sama who achieved being born anew as a child of God and became a complete human being in the eyes of God. I know I've shared this before, in other occasions and other studies, but I believe it is truly important for us to see this and internalize this and really accept this truth, right? Many might ask, why do we talk so much about Meishu-sama, right? Some might think there's no need, but Meishu-sama became a prototype for us. Meishu-sama, as we are learning, became a child of God in the eyes of God to show us that path, that way, and what that means, right? So as we study today, I believe this is truly important for us to recognize what God accomplished through Meishu-sama for each one of us. Okay? So today, without further ado, I'd like to read with you these sacred words of Kyoshu-sama, of Masaaki-sama, and of Meishu-sama. Right? So it was published in Glory, number 27, on April 1st, 2022. Kyoshu-sama and Masaaki-sama receiving the will of Meishu-sama, number 24. Living in heaven while living on earth. In heaven, there is no disease. In Meishu-sama's sacred word, we find the following. Among those who hang our divine scroll, there are quite a few who see images of the sky with purple or golden clouds, or with the moon and stars. This is the state of the highest heaven. In short, what we have to do is to live in heaven while living on earth. And in heaven, there is no disease. Sermon, date unknown. I believe some of you might be seeing this for the first time. Some of you might be reading it again. But there are a few things that caught my attention, right, on this sacred word. One being that, as members are hanging the divine scroll, the home altar that we have, they see images of the highest heaven. Meishu-sama is talking about here. Images of the highest heaven. For those of us who have a home altar, have we really ever stopped to consider what it means to be permitted to have such an altar at home? Right? And the fact that this highest heaven exists. Above that, Meishu-sama says, or with that, I should add, Meishu-sama says, in short, what we have to do is to live in heaven while living on earth. And in heaven, there is no disease. So one could ask, right, how do we live in heaven while living on earth? Right? With all this that's going on in the world, how can one live in heaven? Right? Is the world outside going to change for me to be able to say that I'm living in heaven? Does everything have to change to what I think that heaven is to say I'm living in heaven? How exactly is that to take place? And this, I believe, is, as I've mentioned in so many studies, why it is so important to receive the sacred words of Kyoshu-sama, of Masaaki-sama, right? To really see what this means. Really begin to comprehend, even if just a little, what Meishu-sama is saying here, right? So as Kyoshu-sama being the one who inherits, who receives the will of Meishu-sama, who inherits that, right? I like to read with you the following from Kyoshu-sama in this same article. Kyoshu-sama's sacred word, we have the following. Doesn't heaven exist within you? Doesn't a world absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict exist within you? Doesn't a world filled with truth, goodness and beauty exist within you? Before Kyoshu-sama's sacred words, I never thought of it in this way. As I've shared with you in other studies, for those of you who've been following our studies for a while, right? I always looked out to the world and seeked, right, for this transformation outside without first even thinking about this world that exists within us. But look what Kyoshu-sama is saying, right? He's asking each one of us, doesn't heaven exist within you? Doesn't a world absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict exist within you? A world filled with truth. Doesn't a world filled with truth, goodness, and beauty exist within you? What does that mean? If that world exists within us, what does it mean for each one of us? Kyoshu-sama shares, let me tell you this. You yearn for such a world precisely because that wonderful world, heaven, already exists within you. That is why I always say to you that you have to climb up to heaven existing within you first. Well, actually, you already live in heaven. Did you know that? So to climb up to heaven means to acknowledge that you already live in heaven. I'm going to read this sentence for you one more time. Let me tell you this. You yearn for such a world precisely because that wonderful world, heaven, already exists within you. That is why I always say to you that you have to climb up to heaven existing within you first. So we are constantly seeking this heaven, this perfect world, right? Free from disease, poverty, and conflict because it exists within us. Furthermore, Kyoshu-sama shares, well, actually, you already live in heaven. So you, right now, watching this video, you could be going through many issues in your life, right? Many conflicts, many problems, let's say financial problems, or disease, or many other things. Have you ever stopped to recognize that you are already living in heaven? And to climb up to that heaven means to acknowledge that you already live in heaven. We look at the world outside, right? And it's so difficult for us to acknowledge that we are already in heaven. We see problems with family members, our loved ones, and we say, how could that be heaven? But as Kyoshu-sama is sharing with us, we must first climb to heaven, right? And to climb to heaven is to acknowledge that you already live in heaven. And how do you do that? When you are overwhelmed with all these thoughts, all these feelings, all these occurrences in your life. Kyoshu-sama shares, did you know that at this moment you already exist in heaven and serve in the divine work of Meishu-sama in various ways? That is why many feelings come into your mind. When you engage in activities relating to flowers, those feelings come, don't they? When you interact with people, those feelings, both good and bad, they come, don't they? It is precisely because we are serving in heaven that those feelings come. Didn't we for a long time do the opposite? Didn't we say, I have all these feelings. Could it be good? It could be bad. But they're not heavenly. I'm not in heaven, right? I need to change this, or I need to change that first. right? Before I can go to heaven. Isn't that how most of us, saw and see the world till today? But as Kyoshu-sama says, it is because at this moment you exist in heaven and serve in the divine work of Meishu-sama in various ways. That is why many feelings come into your mind. And he continues, those feelings come precisely because you are already a resident of heaven. In heaven, God is using you in the work of salvation. Through you, God is advancing the work of granting forgiveness to all and accepting and welcoming all into heaven. On Ikebana and Art, October 24th, 2018. God is advancing the work of granting forgiveness to all and accepting and welcoming all into heaven. Masaaki-sama shares, we assumed that a world absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict could not exist anywhere else but on this earth, and we did our best to get there. But whether that world exists within us or not makes a big difference. It may seem small, but there's a very, very big difference. This world is not only within Meishu-sama, but it exists within each one of us too. Meishu-sama had a firm conviction of this. Just making a quick pause here, right? Look at the word Masaaki-sama is sharing with us here, right? This world exists within each and every one of us too. And Meishu-sama had a firm conviction of this, right? It's not saying Meishu-sama was feeling heavenly all the time, right? In other words, many feelings were going through Meishu-sama constantly, but he had the conviction that this world exists within him, right? We, on the other hand, right, as Masaaki-sama says, assume that a world absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict could not exist anywhere else but on this earth, right? Is it not what we strived for so long? For a world here free from disease, poverty, and conflict. We have to do something to create that world, to make that world, right? Was that not what we were longing for the longest time? And like Masaaki-sama says here, right? And we did our best to get there. All our efforts, all our activities were to change this world. But look what he says here, but whether that world exists within us or not makes a big difference. It may seem small, but there's a very, very big difference. He continues, that is why in the sacred word, the uniqueness of the salvation of our church, Meishu-sama was able to say to all of us, followers, that we must climb to heaven first if we want to serve in the work of salvation. And he taught that heaven is within us, and to be united to that heaven is salvation. He said this way of salvation is different, or rather opposite from all the other religions. Right? If Meishu-sama didn't have that conviction that it was within us too, he wouldn't say climb up to heaven first for each one of us, would he? As we are seeing here in the sacred word from Masaaki-sama. Right? And before anything else, we climb up to heaven first. So as Masaaki-sama says, and I'll read it again, he says, that is why in the sacred word, the uniqueness of the salvation of our church, Meishu-sama was able to say to all of us, followers, that we must climb to heaven first if we want to serve in the work of salvation. And he taught that heaven is within us, and to be united to that heaven is salvation. He said this way of salvation is different, or rather opposite, from all the other religions. What is the way of salvation for all other religions? It is to build a heaven on this earth solely through human effort, isn't it? To construct a world free from disease, poverty, and conflict solely through human effort is the usual way for other religions, isn't it? But Meishu-sama is saying that the uniqueness of our salvation is in climbing to heaven before anything else, climbing to the world free from disease, poverty, and conflict. And he is saying that if that power is reflected onto this earth, then that kind of world will certainly come about. So does heaven exist within each one of us or not? This difference seems small, but it is immense. We have the uniqueness of the salvation of our church in a hymn that reads, "Before anything else, I am trying to be a resident of heaven, for into heaven I wish to save people of the world." If you are to save the people of the world into heaven, then you must live there first. And that heaven is a place without disease, poverty, and conflict. If you are able to come into contact with the joy of that world as a result, based on the law of the spiritual preceding the physical, the joy of the spiritual world will be reflected on the physical earth. And that world, absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict, cannot help but be created. Meeting with executive directors, regional directors, and other ministers, October 7th, 2018. This Meishu-sama, who was born anew as a child of God, as the Messiah, became that heaven on earth, as we are learning, right? He came into contact with that joy, and in God's eyes was recognized as God's child one more time. And this path is open for each and every single one of us. And what Masaaki-sama is sharing here is really important for us, right? Because as we are going through those feelings, as Kyoshu-sama mentioned in his sacred word that we just read, it is precisely because we are in heaven that we have those positive and negative feelings, right? But to consciously become aware of this truth and live in that heaven changes everything for us. Wouldn't you agree? Masaaki-sama, as he reads here, he says, if you are to save the people of the world into heaven, then you must live there first. How do we live there? As we just read in Kyoshu-sama's sacred word, we recognize that we are in that heaven. And that heaven is a place without disease, poverty, and conflict. So everything that we are experiencing, disease, poverty, and conflict, are here for us to return to this heaven as we live in this heaven and impart God's blessing, God's forgiveness, God's salvation with all the world, as we just saw in Kyoshu-sama's sacred word. And Masaaki-sama further shares, if you are able to come into contact with the joy of that world as a result, based on the law of spiritual preceding the physical, the joy of the spiritual world will be reflected on the physical earth. And that world, absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict, cannot help but be created. So as you are going through whatever situation you're going through, right, you can participate in the creation of this world, absolutely free from disease, poverty, and conflict. Furthermore, Masaaki-sama shares, heaven is the world where God lives. You can live with God in heaven while living on earth. That, I say, is a paradise on earth. That is, a heaven on earth. Meeting with staff ministers, March 18th, 2016. Is this not what we just saw in Meishu-sama's sacred word? How to live in heaven while living on earth? And how did Meishu-sama do that? Meishu-sama, in the eyes of God, was recognized as a child of God, as a Messiah. Right? As we saw in the hymn today, Meishu-sama became a complete human being in the eyes of God. It opened this path for each one of us, and we can now walk on this path. We can now live in heaven while living on earth, in this heaven of God, where there is no disease, as we just saw in the sacred words of Meishu-sama, and are being guided by Kyoshu-sama and Masaaki-sama how to truly receive that and live in that world today. So whatever it is that you're going through, do not forget it is because you are in heaven at this moment. And even if you do forget it at that moment, right? When you come around and remember these words, then at that moment, we can, with a repentant heart, return that to God and share this blessing of God with all those who are alive within us, all those who are alive within around us, family members, friends, the whole world, and truly live in heaven while living on earth. As Masaaki-sama shares in this last slide, if you can live with God in heaven while living on earth, that, I say, is a paradise on earth. That is heaven on earth. So with that thought in mind, I'd like to end our study here this week. This reading is available. It's also available on our site. Please look over it, read it again and again. Let us truly acknowledge and live in this heaven of God right now on earth, returning to this heaven and serving God with every thought, every feeling, and everything that is happening in our lives today. Thank you so much. May all honor, may all glory be returned to God always.